This is a classic example of an album that comes out, fills me with joy, and then eventually I get to this point of diminishing returns. Now, what I want to know is, will this album, persevere and come out the other end where I end up loving this album and return to it quite regularly? Or is it an album that just kind of sits on a shelf and collects dust? Well, let's dive into it. Charismatic Leaders by Wheel. So Wheel is a new one for me. I've kind of knew about them in the whispers of the progressive metal landscape. And they are from Finland, the good Finnish band from Helsinki. You know what? They're from Finland. They consist of James Lascelles on vocals and lead guitars, Santeri Saskala, I believe, on drums, and Jesse Turnin on lead guitars. And yeah, they've been pretty prolific since 2017. They've released 3 EPs and 2 albums, with their third album being this one that we're talking about right here. These guys are the kind of band that I've been seeing a lot lately, especially within the prog metal landscape, where you can see the DNA of a lot of their influences really baked into the formula of whatever it is that they're playing. And I think the most notable band in this case would be Tool. There's a lot of Tool homages found within this particular album. And sometimes that works to its advantage, and sometimes it kind of takes me out of the music itself because I'm like, oh, that's just a Tool riff. Now, for the most part, it works. And I will at least give them credit where, I know a lot of people weren't necessarily all that excited about the last Tool album of Fear Inoculum, whereas I friggin' love that record. I feel as if they are kind of infusing it with more prog metal aspects and kind of carrying the music forward. And that is particularly, I'm going to skip right to the end with one of the longer tracks on here, The Freeze, which sounds right out of 10,000 Days. You've got that chugging guitar that's very akin to a Tool. You have that kind of singing style that Tool loves to employ on here. And again, if you didn't know any better, you'd think that this is a kind of like a lost scrap from a 10,000 Day recording sesh. But that being said, they do move beyond their influences quite nicely. They're doing a lot of things that Tool would never touch. They're trying a lot more in the accessibility soundtracks and, trying a lot of stuff that I think a lot of prog metal bands are really flirting with. Like, a lot of this kind of sounds like Temic from last year. They're really building on this accessible, catchy songwriting ship that they're kind of infusing within the chorus, while also having these really powerful, really chugging guitars and singing styles on that case. Empire opens up the record beautifully. It's 420, nice blazer bra in terms of length, and so it's a very bite size, very shareable, kind of radio friendly edit that really gives you an idea of what Charismatic Leaders is going to sound like. It's a perfect opening track because it lays down the foundation for the rest of the album moving forward. Porcelain being the second track, I'm not as excited for, even though I think it's a little bit more accessible than Empire. It has a much more of a catchy hook. Like, I'm thinking of like some of the new metal outfits that we got in like the very early 2000s, like something that like Linkin Park would be playing with, just in terms of having very catchy, very accessible choruses in and around these very aggressive, very tightly knit verses that are kind of flouting around it. Then we come into the third track of Submission, which is the longest track at over 10 and a half minutes. And for me, this is where the album really shines. And this is where Wheel kind of takes a sidestep to play outside of their influences. Because the track is over 10 minutes, it really allows them to open up and really develop the song. For the first half, it seems like a pretty conventional prog metal piece. We're going from one point to another point to another point, but then we get into this root. It feels like the band really hunkers down and develops this one particular soundscape that then grows and grows and grows. And that I love. I love when a band just kind of stops, hunkered down, and just really develop this sound so that by the end, it's this massive Goliath of a soundscape that really shows how far they've come. I just kind of wish that there was this big explosion that happened. It felt like they kept twisting the coil and twisting the coil and twisting the coil, but never allowed that tension to be released. It was just kind of contained, and just kind of let it vibrate for the rest of the track. And that's fine, but I was kind of hoping for that big release. And I guess the same can be said about the next track of Saboteur. We're touching about the 9-minute mark in here. So again, another lengthy track, one that's able to kind of stretch its legs. And what I really particularly enjoy is the play style between the bass work and the drums. Like the rhythm section of this really does, it gives me a big smile. And if you look on Bandcamp and you see if you like Charismatic Leaders, you might also like, and you see Earthside's album from last year, Innate Passage from Elder, and Witness from Vola. I'm like, okay, yeah, you can definitely see how these albums are very similar in their approach of what they're trying to do together. And I really, really appreciate that. But with Saboteur, I like that we're not just building up one sequence like we did with Submission. We're kind of trying one side and another thing and then another aspect. It kind of feels like we're at an all-you-can-eat buffet and we're just taking little pieces here, here, and here, and then trying to knit them together to see, how can these passages fit? And sometimes it does trip a little bit. Like there are some handing off from one passage to another that I don't feel was quite earned or was kind of stitched together very well. Like it didn't feel all that organic. It just felt like these two ideas that they didn't know how to connect, and they're like, oh, we'll just put them together, and I'm sure that will work. But for the most part, at least it does kind of bleed fairly well together. And the one thing that the band is able to do, and it's captured both on Saboteur as well as Disciple, is their ability to just have this very meaty chug that I love. And that is where they kind of center these tracks over. And with Disciple being about 4-ish minutes, the song really is rooted over this one lick, this one chug, this one very tasty riff that everything is kind of built around. And yeah, if it's good, man, it makes a really tasty track. But if it doesn't, then you're just kind of left there being like, okay, it's all sizzle but no steak. And I think that's part of the reason why once those initial riffs were digested by me, I wasn't really left with too much else. And this was definitely found within the last two tracks, Caught in the Afterglow, which is basically just a prelude to The Freeze, the final track. And the final track, I think, is the poster child for everything that I love and everything that I felt lacking with this album. And it's something that I've mentioned just previously, which is once those initial riffs are digested and you kind of recognize that they're really taking 46 and 2 or The Grudge or, all these really big standout tracks from Tool. Once they kind of reworked that and made it into their own, you're not really left with too much underbelly. There's not a whole lot to dive real deep into it. So even though that The Freeze is one of the longer tracks, again, we're at 10.5 minutes, and it really does allow the tracks to grow and allows this particular piece to really blossom, I just was kind of left with wanting more. It wasn't necessarily wanting more in the case of starting the album over again and, re-listening to it right from the beginning. It left me wanting more in that I wanted more out of what I was hearing. Maybe I wanted a little bit more of a dynamic in the mix. Maybe I wanted a little bit more background noise. Maybe I wanted them to develop some of these ideas a little bit more. I can't quite put my finger on what it was that I was missing because upon my first, say, half a dozen listens, I love this record, and I looked forward to every time I listened to it. But once I crest that 7th, 8th, 9th listen, I just kind of felt like there wasn't enough there. Again, it was kind of all sizzle, no steak in that case. It's kind of like the sauce was so good. Like they got lost in the sauce, and I absolutely loved it. But then the actual thing that they had the sauce on wasn't all that excited. It's kind of like a really, really good sauce that you put on a bland chicken. Like the sauce itself is really good, but then once you lick off all the sauce, all you're left with is a boiled chicken. And that sounds so bad, but I will admit, I love the time that I had with this album. I was just, hoping for a little bit more. So in the end, Charismatic Leaders from Wheel was still an album that I really, really enjoyed listening to. And I still get a lot of enjoyment out of it. It's just, I feel like I kind of peaked, crest, and I'm starting to come into the downfold. My final rating of this album ultimately is Charismatic Leaders by Wheel is one that I would still ultimately download. I can personally see a lot of people loving this record. I can see a lot of metalheads really, really gravitating to this. And there is a lot to love on this record. I found myself diving into this record more than once. Like, I kept feeling called back to it. I just wish there was a little bit more stay power on this. I wish that they had kind of removed themselves from their influences, and that's something that I just keep saying about modern prog music overall, is that I wish they would develop their own style of music, their own signature sounds, rather than going back to the well of prog music that had worked in the past. So, yeah, I ultimately had a great time with this. I would recommend it. Check it out. You'll probably find something really, really tasty on this one. And that's what I've got for Charismatic Leaders from Wheel. What did you guys think about this record? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, please let me know by commenting down below. And yeah, that's what I've got for you guys today. So thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.